Hey there, folks. This is the Eric Metaxas Show. Hard for me to believe it's Tuesday, and hard for me to believe I'm sitting here again with my friend Dinesh D'Souza, because it seems like every time I turn around, he has a new book out. But frankly, this one I mentioned a few minutes ago in the previous segment is titled "The Big Lie." The Big Lie: Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Now, before I bring Dinesh in, I just want to say, think about this. Exposing the Nazi roots of the American left. That sounds absolutely shocking to make a claim like that. But if anybody can make that claim, if anybody can back that up, Dinesh D'Souza can, and I'm sure will, because I have never read anything by him that I said, oh, no, he's off. Dinesh, I'm thrilled to have you here. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Nice to be on the show.
Let me tell you, nobody who writes, except maybe for Ann Coulter, is willing to say things that no one else is willing to say. I would say you're alone in that. And when you say something, I guess I want to say this to my audience up front. Maybe some of them don't know you the way I do. You're not a man of hyperbole. There are people who speak hyperbolically. There are people who speak in a way that's intentionally incendiary. They want to kind of provoke and whatever. You, I know, do your research, and when you say things, I read your books, you do not overstate it. You're not looking to punch somebody in the face and start a fight. You want to expose things. You want to, but sometimes, because of the culture in which we live, it's impossible for us to believe that this could be true. And so I want to say that up front. You say the title of the book is The Big Lie: Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. So what do you mean in this book? And by the way, the book is brand new, so congratulations.
Thank you. Let's look at it this way. For about a generation in American politics, it was customary for the left to play the race card, accuse Republicans, conservatives of being bigots, of being Christians, and also implying that the history of bigotry was a history that came somehow from the right. In my last book, Hillary's America, in the movie, I kind of took on that narrative, challenged it. Now, since Trump, the race card has been replaced by a new card. I could call it the fascism card. And when I say the fascism card, I don't just mean a kind of a casual accusation. I mean that this is, you can call it the meta story, the story behind the story, the underlying premise not only of what is said, but a lot of things that are done. So people dress up in anti-fascist costumes, carry weapons, and they disrupt speakers on campus. Why? They think they're fighting Hitler in the 1930s.
And listen, to be fair, I always try to be fair. Many of the people, there are two categories. There are many people on the left who have no part in any of this stuff. They're well-meaning people. They might not agree with us politically, but they're good people who would not want any part in all of this. And so when they hear this, I'm sure they think, oh, my goodness, you're crazy. Then there are other people who are participating in this who genuinely believe, and I would argue that most of them do, that they're fighting some kind of fascism. Just as you said that they're fighting, they actually believe this. So we need to give them that even though I believe they're wrong, they genuinely somehow believe that it's a scorched earth policy. We're operating at a time where anything goes because we are fighting the devil.
Exactly. They've been told that Trump is such an abnormality that his election, whether it be lawful or no, nevertheless is inherently illegitimate. In other words, people are reminded, well, didn't Hitler come to power, at least in a quasi-legal fashion?
And many of them, this is the horror to me, is that many of them are using my Bonhoeffer book to prove their point.
That they're the new Bonhoeffers.
Even though I disagree with them. Because, look, just because there are parallels doesn't mean that it's a parallel. You know what I'm saying? Like if somebody has blonde hair, and so it's not really they're wrong, but again, they do believe this.
They believe it, and so then the question becomes, why do they believe it? And see, this is part of my contention. The reason they believe it is that they have been actually sold a kind of big lie.
Yeah.
Now, that big lie, which has been sold since when? Well, since the end of World War II. Before World War II, fascism was recognized really by everybody, to be a phenomenon largely of the left. Mussolini was probably the most prominent Marxist in Italy when he founded the Fascist Party. Hitler called his movement National Socialism. In fact, he changed the name of the German Workers' Party to italicize the socialism.
And by the way, we have to underscore this. Ladies and gentlemen, do you hear what Dinesh is saying? National Socialism. These are, by definition, things that we would say are on the left. But they have been repackaged. Now, you said this happened after the World War II.
Yes. Before World War II, the progressives, which is the kind of the left wing of the Democratic Party, very enamored by Mussolini and somewhat enamored by Hitler. When I say very enamored by Mussolini, FDR was so enamored by Mussolini that he sent members of his brain trust to Italy, to Rome, to study fascism because he saw fascism as A, on the left, and B, more progressive than the New Deal. So he thought, they've come up with all kinds of ideas that I haven't even got to. Let's bring them over here.
Okay. Now again, I'm going to interrupt you 1,000 times, and you have to forgive me in advance. But the reason I do this is that you're saying things that are so outrageous. I want to stop and say, ladies and gentlemen, read this book and listen to what Dinesh is saying, because these are not crazy things. These are true. What you just said, I've never heard in my life. FDR, whom we revere, even though he's, the father of 20th century liberalism in his way, he did what you just said. Now, why have I never heard this in my life?
Because it's hard to find it in a textbook. It's been erased from sort of the conventional wisdom. Now, I should say that even though that's the case, there it is in the historical record. In other words, I never rely on any sources that are not mainstream.
Right.
I never put out facts that are in some way, this is my view of the matter. No.
But that's the point. These things are absolutely incontrovertibly true. There's evidence. So there's nothing crazy in what you're saying. But what's crazy to me, and this is in a way the thesis of your book, is that we never hear these things.
Right. I think so the head of FDR's NRA program, the National Recovery Act, the centerpiece of the New Deal, this guy, Hugh Johnson, was an open fascist. He actually carried around a charter of Italian fascism and would read to people praise of Mussolini everywhere he went. Now, after the war, fascism became ineradicably stained with Holocaust. And so today when we think of fascism and Nazism, we think of Auschwitz, for example. So it's almost like we have to go behind history to recover the original appeal that caused, for example, the German people to stick with Hitler through a terrible war that decimated their way of life. Why did they do it? What was the original appeal of that fascism? Well, it was the appeal of collectivism, of we're all in this together. If you read from speeches of Mussolini, you think you could recite them at the Democratic National Convention to thunderous applause.
It's I want to say it again and again and again. What's always shocking about the things that you write to me is that they're true. In other words, there are a lot of people who make statements and things. You're saying things. The most shocking thing of all is that we never hear these things. And so you write a book, and many people, if they don't read it, and many people won't read it, they'll dismiss it and denounce it, they say, this is ridiculous, it can't be true. Well, folks, again, if you listen to this program, you know I'm pretty careful about this stuff. These things are true. And if they're true, it is scandalous. It's scandalous that we don't know them. There are many wonderful things that are true. It's scandalous we don't know those wonderful things. There are many horrible things. This book is full of these horrible things that have really been erased, I would say, from the public record. They're still there, but no one ever refers to them.
Yes, and what happened is that the progressives who were coming to power in the academy, in the media, in Hollywood, in the 50s, they saw these things and they knew about them. And they also realized how damaging it would be if people found out, and let alone young people, a whole generation of young people. They said, if young people know that this is the actual history of the Democratic Party and of the progressive left, we're finished.
Yeah.
So they set about a task of revisionism. And essentially their main successful project was to move fascism and Nazism from the left-wing column, where it always belonged, into the right-wing column. And that paved the way for all the stuff we hear now. Trump is a fascist. fascist, all that comes out of the lie that fascism is a phenomenon of the right.
There's a lot more here. We're going to go to a break. I want to say before we go to the break, just the other day, I thought of the term. I heard it, or maybe I read it in the New York Times, of course. It said something about right-wing extremism. Right-wing extremist. I thought you never hear left-wing extremist. There's something dark here, and we need to uncover it. We'll be right back with Dinesh D'Souza. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. I'm sitting here with Dinesh D'Souza. He has a new book out. Dinesh, this is such a big deal, okay? The title is The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. I'm going to say it again to my audience. These things would be considered incendiary. In a way, they are incendiary, what you state here. And yet, it's not intentionally incendiary. What you say is simply true. It's shocking, but I want to tell people, gird your loins and dare to dive into the evidence, because sometimes shocking things are actually true. What you write here is true, and I would argue that every American needs to be aware of it. So I hope they'll get your book just so they can read for themselves. But while we're sitting here, let's continue helping them understand.
Yeah, there's just a great deal for us to learn about fascism and Nazism. When people say that Trump is a fascist, for example, you say, well, why is he a fascist? Well, it's because he's an authoritarian, or it's because he's a nationalist. Trump wants to make America great again. Didn't Hitler want to make Germany great again? Now, authoritarianism and nationalism are, I would call them, incidental features of fascism. And what I mean by that is lots of people are authoritarians without being fascist. There have been countless dictators, for example, around the world. They're authoritarians, but they're not fascists. There are countless nationalists who are not fascists. Gandhi was a nationalist.
Wait a minute. Gandhi was a nationalist. That's very important to say.
Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist.
Why isn't Trump being compared to Gandhi?
Mandela was a nationalist. Castro was a nationalist. Yeah. All the anti-colonial leaders were nationalists. Nkrumah in Ghana, for example. So obviously these people weren't all fascists. So fascism equals nationalism is a shoddy way. Now, here's the point. What is fascism at its core? This is actually not obvious because one way you can describe an ideology is by looking at who is the philosopher who articulated that ideology, right? So if we want to study Marxism, we go to Marx. If you want to study capitalism, you go to Adam Smith. Well, who's the philosopher of Nazism? Or who's the philosopher of fascism? Turns out, nobody knows. No one knows his name. Why? It turns out it's a guy named Giovanni Gentile. He was Mussolini's Minister of Education, considered one of the leading philosophers of his time. Gentile argues that the core meaning of fascism is that the individual is the state. The individual becomes dissolved within the state. Everything in the state and nothing outside the state. That's the core meaning of fascism.
Well, let me ask you, though, how does this differ when we talk about the state over the individual, which is the fundamental antithesis? It's the most fundamental antithesis to American freedom. How is it that this glorification of the state, or this precedence of the state over the individual, becomes fascism? Because I would think of totalitarian, the Soviet Union, any place that puts the state over the individual is not always fascist.
Exactly.
Right.
So now we come to something very profound, which is that there was a crisis of Marxism in the early 20th century. Marx had made a whole series of predictions. He thought that communist revolutions would break out in England and Germany, for example, by the end of the 19th century. That didn't happen. So out of the crisis of Marxism came two spin-off ideologies that defined the 20th century. The first, Leninist Bolshevism, and the other, Mussolini fascism. both fascism and Bolshevism were outgrowths of socialism and Marxism. So,
okay, and again, to point out to my audience here, so this is very strange. It's ironic. You have the state over the individual. We see that clearly in the Soviet Union, which we think of as left can go.
Right.
You see the state over the individual in National Socialism, which today people think of as right as you can go. But both are really totalitarian ideologies that are the antithesis of American freedom and liberty. But somehow, I think because of Hitler, these things have been divided. In other words, Hitler always demonized Bolshevism as the antithesis of National Socialism. But in reality, you're saying, and I'm agreeing, these are effectively the same kinds of philosophies.
Yes, I'm saying that progressivism, socialism, communism, fascism were the great collectivist movements of the 20th century. And they were actually sister ideologies. We get confused about this because they fought in the war, right? Russia fought on one side and Hitler was on the other side. But then we forget the Hitler-Stalin pact. Russia and Hitler were allied before they became enemies. So we also know from history that ideologies that are very close, the Shia and the Sunni, might have bitter fights among each other. It doesn't mean that they aren't very close. They're both within the House of Islam, but nevertheless they disagree on some key point, and they're competing for territory and power.
Well, the big lie, what you're talking about here, is how the Nazi ideology has been adopted by the American left, and how the American left today, and again, when we say the left, we don't mean well-meaning people who have hearts of gold and they differ from us politically, but we're talking about people who really have decided they've got to pull out all the stops to fight something, and they're using tactics that we would actually associate with fascism, except what they're doing very, very cleverly, brilliantly, is they're labeling their enemies as fascists. And this is at the heart of it. When we come back with Dinesh D'Souza, we'll hear more about this, a lot more, folks. Stick around. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. Book just came out. Title is The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. A shocking thesis, unfortunately, absolutely true, and you prove it in the book, Dinesh.
Well, the book has a lot of secret history in it, but it also brings the argument to the present. Because if we look, for example, at the Democratic Party's economic ideology today and ask a simple question, does it more resemble socialism or does it more resemble fascism? Now, socialists all over the world have always nationalized private industry. Their basic idea, the government takes over the energy industry, for example. But that's not what we've seen, and that's not what the left advocates now. What they advocate is sort of government control of the private sector. Look at the healthcare industry. We still have a private healthcare industry, private hospitals, private insurance companies, right, but the government is calling the shots. Another way to put it is that is state-run capitalism. Under Obama, we saw government control over the banks, over the insurance companies, increasingly over the energy sector. Hillary and Bernie proposed government control of higher education, free college. Now, this state-run capitalism is the classic definition of fascism.
Right.
That's exactly what Mussolini wanted. That's exactly what Hitler did. So the fascist name has become toxic, and yet it's a pretty clinical description of the ideological platform of the Democratic Party.
I also want to say this. Part of the reason I do this show and part of the reason I get very excited to talk to you about this book, The Big Lie, is because it's come to my attention over the years that most Americans in previous generations would have been aware of these things. They would have understood that government control is fundamentally un-American, that big government is fundamentally bad. It doesn't mean that there aren't times when we need to have the government to step in. There are always times, but that fundamentally we should be afraid of moving in this direction. We should be very wary. Something has happened. There's a cultural amnesia where people, and oftentimes Christians, people that I would say are evangelical Christians, they're not educated in this, and they don't have the fear of these things that they ought to. They have forgotten that these things almost always lead to a lack of freedom and actually harm the poor rather than help the poor. This, to me, is another reason that I think your book is important, because we really have forgotten some of these fundamentals that if you'd ask your average person in 1955 if they were aware of these kinds of things, they would have said, well, of course. Today, the siren song of big government has an appeal that it didn't have 40 or 50 years ago.
I think many people look to the government as a way of solving problems, not recognizing that many of the people who go into the government look at it as a form of advancement. They look at it as a form of accumulating power. But it's a very dangerous form of power that you don't find in the private sector. So, for example, the people at Apple, they are very powerful. They have a very big corporation, but they have very little control over your actual life. You have to go voluntarily in your car, stand outside the Apple store to get their phone. They can't force you. On the other hand, even the most petty government official, the meter maid, the person at the DMV, the guy who stamped my immigration passport, I mean, that guy had the discretion to decide if I could live the American dream, yes or no. And he was accountable to absolutely nobody. And nobody voted for him. So government takes on a coercive power. This is, by the way, why the fascists were attracted to it. They wanted that kind of power. And so this is part of the reason why we should be wary of these accumulations of power.
Well, again, I think in previous generations, people were wary of these kinds of things, but something has happened in American cultural life since the 60s where we have slowly forgotten these things. I say we've slowly forgotten these horrors that we ought to be keenly aware of. And we've also forgot some of the beautiful stories of our heroes and of what makes America great and these kinds of things. And the combination of the two has led us to this very dangerous pass where you have people, as you say in your book, behaving precisely like fascists while labeling their enemies fascists. And people don't have the basic tools to say, hey, that's crazy. That's like a pacifist waving a gun.
There was a Berkeley professor in the 60s who coined the phrase that could be almost seen now as the ideological manifesto of this Antifa movement, anti-fascist movement. He said, no free speech for fascists. And what he meant is he meant we, the left, are the intolerant people, but we have no obligation to be tolerant. We at the left are the tolerant people, but we have no obligation to be tolerant of the intolerant. And so what the left does now is they simply label their political adversaries intolerant, and then they feel like it's perfectly okay to take brickbats and stones and batter them into submission and silence. So this is the world we're living in now, in which terms like free speech have almost become curse words in certain sectors.
It's wild. In other words, two of the greatest things in the history of the United States of America are free speech and religious liberty, the very foundation of everything we have held dear. And today, both those terms have been demonized by the left. It's absolutely bizarre, and your average American ought to be chilled that these basic things, I mean, we haven't done that with the words freedom and liberty, but we have demonized people who are advocates of religious liberty as fascists, as bigots, against gays or something, which is ridiculous. We've done the same thing across the board, and we've done it with free speech now. It's so bizarre, and this is why I think of this program as a forum to edify and educate, because I want people to be aware of what is happening. It's happening in the media. It's shocking to me that it's happening, but it's happening.
And it seems normal to us. I mean, here's a good example. We have demonized basic rights like free speech, which are in the Constitution, and invented and sacramentalized rights that aren't there. So consider, for example, the way the left looks at abortion. They want the government to fund abortion, right? Now, let me ask you this. the abortion right is not in the Constitution, but let's say it were. It would be in there alongside your First Amendment right to free speech and so on. Now, let me ask you this. You have a radio show, but does the government pay for it? No. You have to pursue your First Amendment rights on your own time and at your own expense. No, the government doesn't fund religion. It doesn't buy us guns, even if we have a right to have a gun.
We're going to go to a break, and we're going to come back. Final segment in today with Dinesh D'Souza. Plenty more tomorrow and the rest of this week. Stick around. Show. Sitting here with Dinesh D'Souza. The book is The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. I hate to be a broken record, but this is so important. Dinesh, I'm just so grateful to you for, as the Greeks say, taking the snake out of the hole. Who's going to do the dirty work of taking the snake out of the hole? By talking about this, you're talking about something a lot of people are thinking about, but nobody has written a book about it.
Well, I didn't know many of the facts that are in this book. I knew, for example, that there were parallels between, for example, the eugenics schemes of American progressivism from the early 20th century and, let's say, the Nazi sterilization laws.
Right.
But what I didn't know is that the Nazis directly derived their eugenics schemes from the American progressives.
Yeah, when I first heard this,
different matter.
I just want to say, I remember, maybe it was 1989, someone said this to me. Somebody said to me, oh, yeah, Margaret Sanger. Oh, she's all tied up with the Nazi, eugenics. And I remember rolling my eyes because I'd just gotten out of Yale, and I was trained to think that this kind of stuff, these people are crazy. And the fact of the matter is, as the years have passed, I've thought, no, this is absolutely factual, that Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood, for example, come right out of the eugenics movement, which actually was behind Hitler's ideas. When you say that, people think you're just crazy. A lot of what you're saying in the book is just like that, but it's more than true. I mean, there are things that are true that you can't quite prove. Everything in this book is something that people can look into. But I fear that people on the left will just be angry at this.
They should. I mean, I'm seeing signs of that. You know, today, for example, there's a sputtering article. I was on Fox and Friends this morning, a sputtering article in Media Matters, basically saying, in effect, Dinesh is actually claiming that Hitler got 3 of his most destructive genocidal ideas from the Democratic Party, and they don't know. They don't know. They can't refute a word of it, but they're sputtering with incomprehension because it's nothing like they've ever heard before. Now, in reality,
and also they just don't want to hear it. And so, what do you do when you don't want to hear something? You try to mock the person into submission, or you try to use whatever you can to shut them up. But in fact, again, ironically, what is that? That's fascist. To shut up people without refuting them, so that everyone can understand what they're saying is false. That's what you do when what somebody's saying is true. You just say, we don't want to get into an argument because we'll lose, so we'll just mock them and shut them up, and we'll demonize them so that no one will read the book.
Yeah, what I said on Fox and Friends was that Hitler was sitting in Landsberg prison, and Hitler was contemplating a problem, and the problem was that he wanted Germany to be a world power, but the British and the French had already taken most of the real estate that there was for the taking. In other words, the British and the French had colonized a good part of Asia and Africa and South America, and as Hitler saw it, there wasn't a whole lot for Germany to take. And then Hitler remembered that in America, the Jacksonian Democrats had thrown the American Indians off their land, driven them further west, exterminated them, and resettled that land, and then if any of them remained, enslaved them. And so Hitler goes, I'll do that. In other words, I don't have to go to India. I don't have to go to Africa. Right here in Europe, we'll throw the Poles off their land. We'll throw the Slavs and the Eastern Europeans off their land. I'll invade Russia. We'll resettle that land with Germans, and if any of those people stay back, we'll enslave them. So the point is, Hitler derives this, not that his appetite for conquest, he already had that, but the specific application of it he gets from the Jacksonian Democrats of the 19th century.
You know, we're out of time. Dinesh, just a joy to be sitting here with you, and a joy to know that you have put this great effort into the book. The book is The Big Lie. Tomorrow, the rest of this week, we'll continue this conversation. Thanks for being my guest.
Thank you.
Which I have to tell you, every American should be aware of what is in this book. One way to do that is to read the book. Sometimes you have to purchase it first. Do what you need to do, folks, and certainly listen to this program because we are unpacking some things that you're not going to hear very much, unfortunately. Dinesh D'Souza is my guest. Dinesh, again, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be on the show.
Well, it's a joy to have you because these are the kinds of things that I always talk about as being necessary for America to exist. You cannot exist unless you know who you are, unless you know what your ideology is, because America is an idea. And if you don't know the truths about what we believe and what we have lived for over 2 centuries, you can't really be America. And we've come to a point in the culture where people are unaware of some fundamental things. For example, when we talk about fascism, when we talk about what is American freedom, a lot of people aren't really clear on this. I wrote about the positive side of it in my book, If You Can Keep It, and it's always shocking to me when I don't know something and I learn it and then I want to tell the world. Your book, in a way, is the dark side, where there are things that have been forgotten about what is fascism and how it is the enemy of American freedom. And in your book, The Big Lie, which is the title, The Big Lie, you talk about how the American left today has adopted what we would think of as National Socialist thinking, fascist thinking. But the irony, of course, is that they accuse their enemies, most notably this president, of being fascist. So you dig into this, and what you say is true. It's horrifying, but we need to understand it. Otherwise, there's no way we can really proceed in this culture and make sense of what's happening.
Yeah, I think what's happening today is that the Democratic left embodies the fascist ideology of the centralized state. That's what fascism is at its core. The fascist philosophers would talk about the state as an organism, a living organism, and each of us is a cell within that organism. The cell by itself is of no importance. The cell is only valuable to the degree that it serves the organism. And this way of thinking that we need to serve some larger entity administered by the state, this is fascism at its core.
Okay, now I just want to make a very, very important distinction here. There's always goodness and truth in every lie. So when somebody says to me, okay, the state's going to take over, the individual is nothing, I know that's bad. But when somebody like John F. Kennedy says, ask not what your country can do, ask what you can do for your country, we all buy into that. We say, yes, there is something to be said for the individual doing something for his country. There's something noble. The difference is, and this is the key difference, is that when Kennedy said it, he proposed it as a beautiful voluntary thing, not as the state forcing the individual. That's the fundamental difference.
Part of what Kennedy was saying, and actually this is the motivation for my own politics. I mean, politics, as you know, dirty business. It's cost me in personal terms, being locked up in a confinement center for 8 months, for example. The reason I do it is I say to myself, my life, my American dream would not have been possible in any other country. And so I need to fight, I need to give back, I need to take part in this debate, even if it gets ugly at times. Why? Because I have this sense of sort of deep gratitude to the country that has made my dream possible. That's what Kennedy's talking about. The fascist idea is a little different. It is that ultimately we have to bring, the Nazis used the term Gleichschaltung, and what they meant was, the word means just literally coordination, but what they meant was, let's bring all of society into line with Nazism.
I talk about this in my Bonhoeffer book, and it's one of those words, I can never pronounce it, but the Gleichschaltung, I think that's close. It's to integrate everything under Nazi philosophy. Now, in my Bonhoeffer book, I famously talk about the horror of when the government said, we also want to integrate the church into National Socialist thinking. In other words, they said everything, including the church, which in America we see as sacrosanct. We say that you have freedom of religion, you have the individual, the conscience of the individual, that the government never can tell people what to think, force them what to believe in terms of ultimate things, religion and so on and so forth. The Nazis and anybody in the fascist side says, no, precisely the opposite. We will determine everything, including the way the church will behave, including the way the individuals will behave. So this is actually, isn't it totalitarianism?
It is, and yet we have a term for it in America. Essentially, it's political correctness. If you think of what political correctness does, is by a combination of incentives and cajoling and intimidation and threats. Because if you step sufficiently athwart modern political correctness, as you know, you can lose your job.
Yeah.
You can be driven from public life. You can be turned into a pariah. So the same weapon. So this to me is actually a more distinctive characteristic of Nazism than just the Antifa protesters in masks who break car windows and burn Starbucks. That was street Nazism, as you know. Those were Mussolini's black shirts and Hitler's brown shirts. But it's even more dangerous when the institutions of the culture are mobilized into a kind of lockstep. Look at the way Hollywood. There's a secret organization in Hollywood called Friends of Abe. Now, these guys literally come in disguise to meetings. They don't reveal their names. They take pseudonyms. This shows that they're terrified that if they were to...
Well, we're talking about conservatives in Hollywood.
We're talking about conservatives in Hollywood.
And they're terrified to be known as conservatives because they'll lose their jobs.
Right, as Tim Allen did when he spoke favorably about Trump. Boom, his show, well-rated, but it's canceled. So this is happening in America now. And I think it's a little bit... we feel it's normal, but it's not normal.
No, it's right out of the pit of hell. I always like to cut to the chase. Life is short. It's out of the pit of hell. These ideas that you're unpacking here, they're happening in our time. When you say Antifa, so people are clear, that's short term for anti-fascist. But as we're saying, as you say in your new book, The Big Lie, the anti-fascists, ironically, are behaving as fascists. They're saying if you don't get in line, you will be purged, you will lose your jobs, you will become a pariah. We had the head of Mozilla lose his job because he had given money to oppose same-sex marriage in California. If you don't toe the line, you will lose your job. This is something that should never happen in the United States of America. It's horrifying to me. I always say that religious liberty means that even if you believe something stupid, you have the right to believe it. You have the right to live it out. The government doesn't have the right to determine those kinds of things. But that's happening right now.
It is, and it shows that this totalitarian streak is not something foreign or European. It really runs right through the human heart. And when we look back, for example, to the 20s and 30s, the progressives in America, as they looked across the pond, so to speak, they were very enamored. Gertrude Stein, the writer, proposed Hitler for the Nobel Peace Prize. W.E.B. Du Bois, the progressive writer, he went to Hitler's Germany, and he came back with a lot of nice things to say about Hitler.
Did you just say that Gertrude Stein proposed Hitler for the Nobel Prize?
In peace, the Nobel Peace Prize.
Gertrude Stein. See, now look, this is my annoying thing. I know a lot of people are annoyed because I interrupt, but I have to say, when I hear something like that, I just want to stop everything. I've never heard this. I was educated at Yale. I read Gertrude Stein. I never heard that Gertrude Stein, who was the mentor to James Joyce and to Hemingway and who has been lauded, there's a statue of her behind the 42nd Street Library in Bryant Park. She's just praised and praised. And you're telling me that she was so enamored of the left, of fascism, that she proposed Adolf Hitler for a Nobel Peace Prize. Why have we never heard this before?
There's a great deal we haven't heard, and I think it's because there was a revisionism that set in the 50s that covered a lot of this up. I mean, here, for example, when the Nazis implemented their forced sterilization schemes in 1933, and then later their euthanasia schemes. Now, by the way, even euthanasia is a Orwellian misuse of the term. Normally, we think of euthanasia as mercy killing, somebody who's in pain, they're very sick. By euthanasia, the Nazis meant we round up the kind of people we don't really like and we execute them.
Yeah.
Right? That was, quote, euthanasia. Well, the Nazis got these schemes from proposals that had been made, not just by Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger supported forced sterilization, but other progressives argued for euthanasia. And one of them, Paul Popenow of California, he said, we need some lethal chambers because we need to do this on a large scale. We need to do it efficiently. So he actually proposed lethal chambers, and the Nazis said, all right, let's impose these lethal chambers using carbon monoxide gas. The recipe for the final solution for the Jews was begun with the euthanasia program. The Nazis, under the T4 program, killed about 200,000 people.
Right.
These were sick, the disabled, the so-called defectives.
We're going to go to a break. Folks, I'm talking to Dinesh D'Souza. The new book is The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Horrifying, unfortunately also true. We'll be right back. Bad Mamma Jamma. We don't have time to go into that right now. I'm talking to Dinesh D'Souza. He's the author of The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. A horrifying thesis. Horrifying because it's true and because Dinesh gives us the evidence in the book. We need to be aware of these things. We need to be aware of the vocabulary of what is fascism. Dinesh, what made you decide to write on this huge idea that you have in the book, in this book, The Big Lie?
Well, I noticed that right after the election, this kind of new theme of fascism was being advanced. And it wasn't just a rhetorical bomb, because it's an incendiary bomb. It's an incendiary accusation about the worst thing you can be called in Western civilization. But it was being used to legitimize things that would otherwise be acknowledged as abnormal and immoral. So, for example, imagine if Republicans had said, we're going to convince the electors who have pledged to Obama not to vote for him. We're not going to attend his inauguration. In fact, we're going to disrupt it. We're going to try to block him from even having an inauguration. We're going to treat him as completely illegitimate, even though he was elected. And if we can drive him from office on any pretext whatsoever, let's say he didn't collude with the Russians. But let's say that he told the FBI, there's nothing here. We'll get him on obstruction of justice, even though the obstruction of justice applies to a crime that wasn't really committed. So normally this would be recognized for the craziness it is. Imagine on campuses where conservatism is not even taught, where young people don't even know what it is. If you were to go to Yale, your alma mater, and say, what do conservatives really want to conserve? They would give you this vacant look, and these are smart kids. Now, and yet, if you send a conservative speaker to campus, they feel like, oh, it's perfectly okay to shout the guy down or drive him off the campus. Now, again, this would be recognized as completely pathological behavior, except that the left says it's needed because wouldn't you do this if you were fighting, Hitler in the early 30s? Think of all the carnage that you could have prevented. Even if you had to do some inappropriate things, they would be completely justified. So I thought to myself, I need to get into this kind of issue and try to understand it from the inside out. That's what drove me.
Well, it's horrifying because it's true, and to my mind, the bigger horror is that Americans have lost the ability, generally speaking, to understand these issues. In other words, when you talk about what fascism is, I've been thinking of this for a year now. When people talk about Trump as a fascist or they talk about these things, I think to myself, listen, you're making a lot of interesting points. I don't disagree with some parallels and things, but fundamentally, you need to reject this. In other words, it doesn't mean that there isn't some evidence, there aren't some ideas and things. You mentioned it in our previous show that people say, oh, nationalism is fascist, and Hitler was a nationalist. And then you have to say, well, folks, I hear what you're saying. However, tell me, what is nationalism? When is patriotism healthy? And when does it come into the realm of jingoistic, chest-beating, crush my enemies nationalism? When does it cross that line? People don't know. What they have done is they've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. They say that Hitler-like nationalism is the same as patriotism in America. And you have to say, no, in America, when we celebrate patriotism, theoretically, we are celebrating everything that stands against the kind of nationalism that Hitler had. But people don't really have the ability to see those distinctions. They are just making very kind of sloppy comments, labeling people fascist, nationalist, without really understanding what these terms are, which is why I'm so grateful for your book, because you get at this.
Yeah, the book is an effort to recover a part of history that has now been submerged. I mean, think of the scene here. An American eugenicist receives a letter of thanks from Adolf Hitler. His reaction, he's unbelievably excited. Why? Because he believes that his work has inspired the Nazi sterilization program.
Now, what year was this?
This would be in the 30s, the early 30s.
Okay, so and who was the person who received the letter?
His name was Madison Grant. He was the president of the New York Zoological Society. Very prominent American progressive.
Zoological Society.
Right. The Zoological Society was at that time kind of the name for a scientific association. So he goes rushing to a friend of his, a fellow eugenicist, and he goes, guess what? I got a letter from Hitler. And that guy goes, check this out. He goes to his library and produces his letter from Hitler. In other words, we're creating a mood in America where leftists in America, prominent people, were very excited at the notion that their ideas had motivated the Nazi sterilization and euthanasia schemes.
Okay, and of
Today,
course, we have to be clear. They weren't aware that this would lead to the Holocaust. In other words, once the Holocaust happened, they had to run from any association with Hitler.
That's absolutely true. They had no idea it would lead to that, and that represented an escalation because Hitler began with the euthanasia program. Now later, when he set up the death camps, they were also using carbon monoxide before they came up with Zyklon B, and they moved many of the personnel that were administering these euthanasia camps to the death camps. So there's actually a chilling association. But yes, none of us has the people living in history cannot look at history in the rearview mirror. They're living through it.
Right.
Fascism after the war came to mean something quite different.
Well, this is why we are where we are today, because we've lost the ability to see these things, to make these distinctions. And folks, I hope you're listening to this program. I hope you get a copy of The Big Lie by Dinesh D'Souza, because if we do not recover the ability to see these things for what they are, it's over. Stick around. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. D'Souza, his new book, brand new book called The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Horrifying. If you are a liberal listening to this program, try to hear this and try to look into it for yourself, because the good things about liberalism have been obscured by what we are now talking about. And I would argue that the left has been taken over by these things. It's a horror. And I know that there are many good liberals who don't agree with this, but they don't really have a voice anymore.
The beauty of the times that we live in is that it's very easy to check information. So there's explosive material in the book, but you don't have to take it on my word. Not only do I provide the sources, but you can look it up. It's a little bit like when I did the last movie, Hillary's America. I made the startling claim that in 1860, the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. I claim that all the slaves in America, 4 million of them, were owned by Democrats. Now, the beauty of this is it's a sort of scientific claim because it's very easily refutable. If you can give me a list of 5 Republicans who owned slaves, I would have to take it back. But no one can. So even though there was a massive thrashing around to find a single counterexample, in fact, someone told me, I found it. Ulysses S. Grant inherited a slave on his wife's side. And I said, well, that is true, but at the time, Ulysses S. Grant was a Democrat. So even on the single counterexample, I was able to sort of swat it back. And this book is full of stuff like that, but it's, in today's era, quick, it's easy to verify, and you can make up your own mind.
Well, again, I think that the reason it's so difficult to get this kind of thing across today is because of what you were talking about earlier, the politically correct culture, the mainstream culture. When we talk about mainstream culture, we're not talking about Main Street. We're talking about Hollywood, and we're talking about the fascist cultural left. They have basically said, if you don't agree, we will demonize you. We will threaten you, and we will follow up. You will lose your job. You've seen this over and over again, that if somebody says, I am a Christian, I have a biblical worldview. My view of human sexuality comes out of the Bible. I believe that sex is only supposed to happen between a husband and his wife. That's my belief. You don't have to agree with me. I'm happy to talk about it, but that's my belief, and it's very important to me. And in fact, this belief goes way back into many cultures. It's not just a biblical idea. In this day and age, many people believe that, but they're afraid to speak up, because they believe that they know that they will be demonized, they will be shut down, they will be threatened in very serious ways with losing their job, losing income, losing their reputation.
That's it. That's gleichschaltung. In other words, they are being, in a sense, you may say, bludgeoned into conformity. We can say it 10 different ways, but the truth of it is they are being forced. And they are being forced not because someone has shown them that their way of thinking is wrong. It's not that someone says, you've got an erroneous anthropology, Eric, and let me show you what modern... No, it's just if you say that, we'll make sure that you never work again in this town or at all. And this shows that even, people ask me, why are the Republicans such wimps? Why is Boehner such a wimp? Why is And I say, look, it's not that they're wimps, but it is that they are terrified by the power of the media. Because the media in our country has the power to humiliate, and they have the power to make you such a pariah that your own side will bury you. And so the Republican leaders know this. And so they're not just fighting the Democrats. That would be one thing. They're fighting the huge megaphones of academia, Hollywood, and the media, allied with the Democratic Party.
Right.
And that's a whole different thing.
Well, this is the thing. But this is, in fact, why we need courage. I would say they are wimps. In other words, that if you're in public life, you need to know what you believe. You need to have courage. We have had leaders like that in the past. We need leaders like that. Everybody points to Bonhoeffer like he's so great. And I think, well, Bonhoeffer would say you should be able to do the same thing, because what you do will affect those around you. If people would begin to speak up, everyone who's afraid to speak up would say, oh, so-and-so has spoken up. So-and-so has spoken up. Maybe I can speak up. And again, when you talk about a biblical view of sexuality, a biblical view of the human person, the very idea that people want to shut you up and say that's out of bounds should be deeply offensive to every American. I don't care whether you believe it or don't, but the idea that you would be shouted down and shut down for advocating an old idea that people since the earliest days of any civilization have held these ideas to be true, it's un-American, and we should get angry because it's un-American, not because you agree. Because there are plenty of people that I would say they have different views than I do on the gay situation, but they would say, well, in America, we're entitled to have these views. The idea that we would be shouted down, people should right away know if somebody's trying to shout you down, it's because they're afraid to have a conversation.
Yes, and I think this power becomes even more terrifying when you mobilize the state behind it. Because we live today, Eric, in a time when the government, even the post office, has a SWAT team. So these days when they come to your house, it's not two federal agents, for example, in a suit with a notepad. There are dozens of police cars, helicopters above, weapons drawn. And this is on American citizens. You know, the government spies on American citizens. So this stuff is happening in America. And so I think if the average American was fully aware of it and aware that when you're not in their sights, you might feel safe, but the moment you come into their sights, you feel this intense vulnerability. I felt it myself. Dozens of FBI agents reading all my books, you know, trying to find a single line that they can use to lock me up. And this is in America. This is going on now.
People need to realize you've lived this. We'll be right back, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas. Oh, we've got a minute left. I'm sorry. You've lived this. And a lot of people might not know your story, but that you dared to go up against the Obama administration, and they used the full force of government. In your case, this really happened, and you've documented it. You made a film about it in part. You lived this. And every American should be disgusted, should be outraged, even if they hate your politics. The idea that the government would do such a thing to a private citizen, this is a scandal.
Here's the thing. I gave $20,000 to a candidate running for the Senate. Had I given it through a PAC, it would have been fine. I wasn't getting anything in return, so there was no corruption. Normally, these cases aren't even prosecuted. If they are, they make you pay a fine, and that's the end of the matter. But the Obama administration wanted to put me in prison for 2 years.
They wanted to get you.
And that would have immobilized. I mean, I would not have been able to make my movie on Hillary if that had occurred.
We're going to go to a break. We'll be right back talking to Dinesh D'Souza.
13-month-old baby. You know I couldn't sleep, wouldn't sleep, tossing and turning about, thinking about the way it's been, hey, it's been so hard to figure out.
Hey there, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. I'm talking to Dinesh D'Souza. The new book is The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. A horrifying thesis, horrifying because, unfortunately, it's true. Dinesh, I can only imagine that there are many people that are going to agree with this right away, but there are many people that are going to say, you're a bomb thrower, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, and so that's why I think it's incumbent on people, if they're going to be fair, not to me, but to themselves, to say, is this a fact? Let me find out yes or no. So let me put out a fact. It is a fact that when the Nazis got together, the senior Nazi officials, to draft the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 were laws that were aimed at discriminating against Jews, no intermarriage between Jews and Germans, segregating Jews into ghettos, state-sponsored discrimination, confiscation of Jewish property. That came a little bit later. No, so the Nazis sit around and they go, we want to create the world's first racial state, in which a state based upon a racial supremacy. And then one of the Nazi officials says to them, actually, such a state has already been created. And the Nazis are like, what? And he says, it's been created by the Democrats in the American South. They've got segregation laws. They prohibit intermarriage. They have state-sponsored discrimination. And all we have to do, in effect, and now I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, is cross out the word black and write in the word Jew, and we've got our laws, right? Now, where do I get this? I get this from actual transcripts of leading Nazis who formulated the Nuremberg Laws. It's been reported also by an American historian, James Whitman of Yale Law School, in his book called Hitler's American Model. This is all discussed. I'm not saying anything that's even really controversial because these records are right there.
Well, it's incontroversial. It's controversial because it's inconvenient and nobody wants to hear it. Also, when you say the American South, the Democratic Party, the narrative has been hijacked by the cultural elites, so that when you think of racist bigots in the South, you think of right-wing extremists. But you're saying that's
yes.
not true. But this is what I'm saying. This is the kind of thing that we've got to talk about this over and over, because people don't seem to understand that these were Democrats.
Right. The big lie is so insidious. You may also almost say it operates on both sides of the aisle. So the first part of the lie is to deny that the Nazis derived their blueprint for the Nuremberg laws from the Democratic Party in the South. That's the first part that's denied. The second part is a pretense that the South and not the Democratic Party was to blame. Now, I want to point out, every segregation law in the South, without exception, was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, and enforced by Democratic officials. When we think of all the bad guys of the civil rights movement, Bull Connor, the sheriff who would turn dogs and hoses on the civil rights protester, Democrat. Orville Forbes, the Arkansas governor who stood in the gates of the public schoolhouse blocking little black kids from going to school, Democrat. And on it goes. So part of the lie is to camouflage the complicity of the Democratic Party, which was the party of segregation.
This is amazing. Folks, we're out of time for this show. Get a copy of The Big Lie. Dinesh D'Souza is the author. Dinesh, my gratitude to you for everything you're doing, for taking it on the chin for the cause, because this is about America. Thanks for being my guest.
My pleasure.